Hello nerds, my name is not Hot Diggity Demon, and I'm still trying to make this game work. In my last video, I said this would be a relatively small update, saying, and I quote, "The next update, it's probably going to expand and improve the underground exploration to make the game feel more in-depth." And I mean, I did do that, but I also did some other stuff and things that makes the game cooler. For starters, I fixed a bunch of small, minor things that fellow game developer and certified chill dude BananaCraft69 noted, including such quality of life updates as the screen not jittering when walking into a wall, enemies despawning when far enough away, the minimap working closer to normal, although I still do have to fix it, and on a side note, the full screen map is now much better. Cleaning up the files in the console, fixing the world generation crashing sometimes while generating the world, making the player control less slidey so that it's easier to move around, bullet drop functionality for more interesting weapons in boss fights, and a pause screen. These small polish fixes don't honestly add a whole ton to the game, but I'm hoping that they make the general game experience a lot better. If you found any small details you want me to change, you can comment below now, and I'll see what I can do about it. After working on all of those minor world polish additions, I thought something was still missing from the game, so I made the world 4 times the width and 2 times the height again. It's now the exact same size as a large Terraria world, and it still only takes a couple seconds to generate. You might also notice from my last video that there's only about 10 to 20 caves spread out across the entire world. That's not quite how Terraria caves work, so I changed cave generation to be a lot less spaghetti and a lot more meatballs. Although there is still spaghetti. It's now much more reminiscent of Terraria world gen, especially when you compare screenshots of both worlds side by side. The moment I made this change though, the world felt 10 times emptier, so I decided something had to change. I thought a desert biome was needed, so I made a couple new blocks, some new variables, and 2 or 3 changes to some code in a couple minor places, and bada bing bada boom, a new biome. The generation on this one is a little strange and hard to traverse, and there's unironically more sandstone than sand, so it's more of a mesa or a badlands biome than a desert biome, but it's still cool in my humble opinion. This biome did have absolutely nothing going for it though, so I spent a day and a half on the next large feature, the pyramid. This structure, as well as probably most of the rest, I'll be adding for the rest of this game, and I will be adding a decent amount of new structures as the game goes on, don't worry. It is completely procedural, which means I can make this pyramid as big or as small as I want, as well as the size of the roofs. There's new loot in here as well, which is probably the next thing I should touch on. I don't know why I didn't do this earlier, but I just added some new functionality to my game that'll make the weapons much more diverse than they were before. Let me explain. When I structured the items, I made each item have an item ID. There are only 14 of these at the moment. The ID determines the behavior of the item. For instance, an item ID of 0 is just an ingredient, think of Leviathan scales or corrupted plates, while an item ID of 3 is the base sword, and an item ID of 7 is the base pickaxe. Each item ID has a predetermined behavior, which means that all swords will behave exactly the same. Any extra functionality I wanted to add to an item in previous updates, I had to manually add to that item ID's code. When I wanted to make swords shoot bullets or make swords into lasers, I had to go into the sword code and add checks to see if the sword shoots bullets or not, or if it's a laser. This update though, I added item ID 14, which is the custom weapon ID. Custom weapons instead have their own unique weapon ID aside from their item ID, which the code for the item ID 14 uses to determine the behavior of this specific item. Instead of the item being classified as one of the 4 following weapons, it's now just weapon number 4 or weapon number 20. I still have to add each individual weapon's code, but I don't have to add that code to every sword. That only gets used for some swords. When the player uses an item with the item ID of 14, the code gets the specific weapon ID and then uses the code that corresponds to that specific weapon. This allows me to program many more unique weapons, although I've only used 2 of those so far, and one is kinda just a regular weapon with a very small difference. I also did the same thing for accessories. Previously, they were only able to affect 9 different stats: your defense, your health, your mana, your speed, and your damage for every class. Now, on top of that, each accessory has a number that corresponds to a special effect. For instance, effect number 1 is that while the player is in the jungle, their speed and defense increase. I can make custom accessory effects now, which means that an accessory that summons a little dude is now possible, where before it wasn't. For example, there's this accessory which has a 1 in 6 chance of shooting a crystal when you get attacked. Now that I had all this code for new fancy items implemented, I needed some excuse to use it, aside from the previously mentioned desert temple. So I added 2 new procedural structures. The next structure I added is the geode, which is found deep underground. It's very large, and it has these massive crystals of mithrilite, an ore that is currently impossible to mine. Inside is the aforementioned crystal shooting accessory. It took a while to make, so in an effort to pad this video's runtime, I'm gonna explain how they're generated. Step 1 is to pick a random point anywhere in the map, as long as it's between 40% and 75% down the world. Then we set a random size. For every block within a square of that size, we check if the block at that point is close enough to the center of the square. If it is, we set it to air. If it nearly is, we turn it into geode wall. This gives us a pretty empty circle, sure, but we still need the spikes in the geode. It took me a while to figure out how these should generate, but I eventually got it. First, we pick an offset from the center of the circle so that the crystals don't all touch the center. Then we pick an angle at random and shoot a point off into the void at that angle. Whatever block that point is on, we set to crystal, and once we're far enough from the center, we create 2 new points on either side of the original one, and set the blocks at those points to crystal as well. Repeat as many times as needed for the desired girth. Repeat that 4 to 6 times with relatively small offset, and you have the large spikes. Repeat more often with greater offset for smaller and more numerous spikes to more closely mimic an actual geode. I'm quite proud of the way these look and generate, and given how much ore is in these geodes, I'm gonna have to make the items crafted from mithrilite really expensive. The next thing I added were these underground houses. They're not quite as interesting as Terraria's underground houses, so the underground still isn't very cool to explore, but it is better than what it was. Each biome's underground houses are exactly the same except for the loot that they have. Each biome has at least 2 different items that can appear in these chests, as well as generic items like healing potions and ore. I will admit that there's blind spots in the loot distribution. There are 2 melee weapons and no summoner weapons, but there is something there for almost everybody. Overall, this world makes the update a little bit more interesting, I hope, but it's definitely not the end. I'm gonna have to make some pretty large polishing changes still and make the underground content more interesting, while adding more room between the start of the game and the first boss. Before I do that though, I'm gonna make the next boss, and then maybe the next, and then maybe the next. Who knows? Make sure to subscribe so you get the poll I'll inevitably make in a few days to ask what I should do first. I have so much stuff I have to do for this game, and I bet there will be so much new stuff I have to do as I continue development. This is gonna take a while. Anyways, that'll be it for today. As always, subscribe, like, send me V-Buck cards over the mail, play the video game, download it in the description, and I think I'm gonna have to add background tiles.